Trump unveiled a plan last month for a Golden Dome to shield the entire United States from missile attacks. China and Russia warn it threatens strategic stability and risks igniting a new arms race. Is the Golden Dome a bold display of American strength, or a sign of insecurity in the new era of space militarization? Will it truly protect America or make the world a more dangerous place? Can Trump build a Golden Dome without Elon Musk? And what does it mean for your money? Hello everyone. Joining me today to discuss this very interesting topic, to say the least, is Dr. Paul Callender. Paul is a senior researcher at Keio Research Institute in Japan. This guy has spent the last 15 years covering space and defense policy. He actually started as a journalist covering the defense sector. He's published extensively in places like Space News, Defense News, BBC even. Paul has an MS in journalism from Columbia University before getting his PhD at Keio University. Honestly, I don't know a better person than Paul in terms of understanding both space and geopolitics and defense. Thank you very much, Paul, for joining me today. What is the Golden Dome? And how's it different than, for example, Israel's famous Iron Dome?
Well, okay. Well, that's a $560 billion or maybe even $1 trillion question, isn't it? So, Golden Dome is a proposed huge, gargantuan scale missile defense system for the United States that, as you probably know, was announced by Donald Trump right at the start of his presidency. Now, its aim is to protect the US from a wide spectrum of advanced missile threats, including ballistic missiles, ICBMs, hypersonic missiles, cruise missiles, to cost about $175 billion. And what makes it special is that it envisions a global constellation of maybe thousands of satellites equipped with very, very sophisticated sensors and space-based interceptors. These are satellites carrying rockets, missiles on them. And these satellites from space, from low Earth orbit, about 500 to 700 kilometers up, would look down on missiles coming up as they're being launched and fire missiles down from space to destroy the enemy missiles shortly after launch during the so-called boost phase. This is when missiles are most vulnerable. You know, the name Golden Dome riffs off a very successful missile defense system called Iron Dome, which most of your readers probably know is Israel's bespoke missile defense system. Now, here, when we look at the difference in names, that's when the similarity ends. Okay, so Israel started really developing the Iron Dome, about 20 years ago. It's been operational since 2011, and it's designed to intercept and destroy short-range rockets from Hamas, probably also from the north. From Iran and so on, artillery shells and mortars at distances of between, and now drones, of course, at distances between 4 and 70 kilometers. And so the Iron Dome is ground-based, okay? It uses radars on the ground, and then it has interceptor missiles in batteries, and it fires those interceptors up against the threats. Now, the key point about Iron Dome is that it's known to be highly effective. So there are reports that it's got a 90% kill rate against targeted threats. So Iron Dome is a small-scale regional system. Okay, it's designed to protect cities, military bases, and so on within a very relatively small flat territory, which is Israel. Okay, and Iron Dome is one layer in a layer of ground-based missile defense systems, okay, which we call a multi-tiered missile defense architecture. Iron Dome also is part of this multi-layered system, which includes David's Sling, for medium range threats, and Arrow for long range ballistic missiles. In contrast, okay, Golden Dome is going to be mainly space based. The modality of the Golden Dome is to fire missiles down from space.
Why does the US feel that it needs the Golden Dome right now?
So the basic premise of Golden Dome is that there are no effective ways to defend against very, very fast ICBM systems and particularly hypersonic missiles. There is no defense available against these missiles. So this was vividly demonstrated on May 22nd, I think in Pakharov in Ukraine, when a Patriot battery was actually taken out by a Russian Iskander M missile. Now, last week, I think it was in Kiev, maybe, we saw the video of a Patriot system. This sent up maybe 4 or 5 interceptors against an Iskander missile, only for the battery to be hit, I think, 12 or 14 seconds later by the Iskander missile that the Patriot battery was trying to take out. Now, the Iskander is a 500-kilometer range missile that flies at Mach 6 or Mach 7. That's about over 6,000 kilometers per second. And the inability of the Patriot to take that out, to take that single Iskander missile out, despite firing 4 or 5 missiles, demonstrates that, the America feels defenseless against increasingly fast and complicated missile threats. Okay, particularly missiles traveling at Mach 5 and above, so above 6,000 kilometers per hour. And we should note that Russia maintains approximately 330 to 350 deployed ICBMs. Okay, it has 12 submarines carrying around 192 warheads. Okay, and BMD systems, Golden Dome or not, cannot defend against those missiles. Meanwhile, the Chinese went really got to work. Okay. And at the moment, they have, I think, about 140 to 150 operational silos of ICBMs, and they're expanding to 450 plus. I think you've probably read somewhere that China's trying to increase its nuclear stockpile from about 500 warheads to 1,000 warheads by 2030. Okay, it also has, I think, 12 Jing-class submarines, and they can carry 72 ballistic missile, nuclear-capable ballistic missiles, which current BMD systems cannot defend against. But let's move on to hypersonic missiles. So hypersonic missiles are much, much, much worse. They're a lot trickier. Okay, the thing about hypersonic missiles is that they are launched from ballistic missiles. Okay, and then the ballistic missiles release what we call hypersonic glide vehicles. These are usually wedge-shaped wedge-shaped devices that carry warheads on them, and these hypersonic glide vehicles, and they can actually be glide vehicles or they can be powered with scramjet engines. They can fly at Mach 7, Mach 8, Mach 9, Mach 10. They'll be even faster than the ballistic missiles, and they can maneuver. They are specifically designed to dodge missile defense countermeasures. What's even worse is that these wedge-shaped hypersonic glide vehicles or power glide vehicles or scramjet glide vehicles, actually they go so fast through the upper atmosphere that they form a kind of plasma sheath, a plasma shield around them, and that makes them not invisible but very, very difficult to detect by radar, the very radars that are needed by ballistic missile defense systems to shoot them down. So maybe to use the technical jargon here, they are an absolute nightmare to defend against. The only way you can really get these threats is on the way up in the boost phase. So there are they before they actually turn into hypersonic glide vehicles, they have to be launched by missiles and get into the atmosphere. And these take 3 or 4 minutes. Okay, so at this point, these first 3 or 4 minutes, these missiles are vulnerable. So, and with a great degree of, credibility, we believe that the only way you can defend against these missiles is to hit them on the way up. Okay, so that is the basic the vulnerability of the US to these missile threats, and also why Golden Dome is proposed as a satellite system, so you can actually shoot down from space and get the missiles on the way up.
Especially the Russians, but also the Chinese have developed these missiles. The US not only doesn't have the way to, defend against these missiles, the US doesn't even have the same capabilities of the Russians and the Chinese when it comes to these weapons.
So at this point, we need to ask, where did those missiles come from? Why were they developed? Okay, and why are they such a threat? So what's special about hypersonic missiles? Okay, so let's go to the origins of these missile threats. So the answer to the first question lies basically about 23 years ago in the June 2002 withdrawal of the US from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile (ABM) Treaty that was in play between the US and what was then the Soviet Union, and this limited the ability of both countries from deploying nationwide missile defense systems in order to preserve the balance of mutually assured destruction. Okay, you can't kill. I can defend against you. You can defend against me. We can't first strike and annihilate each other. Okay, so at that point, so why did Bush or the Bush administration um, leave the ABM treaty? So at the time, the Bush administration argued that the ABM treaty was outdated. Since the end of the Cold War, the US and Russia were no longer enemies, and also that the ABM treaty hindered the US from developing, testing, and deploying new missile defense systems needed to protect the US against emerging threats, specifically from rogue states, the axis of evil. Particularly, for example, Iran was coming along, maybe, particularly North Korea. North Korea was developing hundreds and thousands of no-dog missiles, and also terrorists who may be able to develop missile systems. So maybe somebody like yourself would argue, today, Hamas. Okay, so the Americans said, okay, the Russians are our friends. Russia, you don't need to worry. We're going to develop missile defense systems to protect us against these other threats. But of course, almost nobody believed this. Okay, so Russia and China immediately, along with everybody else, believed that this was basically these development of these small scale BMD systems, ballistic missile defense systems, was a kind of thin end of the wedge towards building up the capability, okay, to develop national ballistic missile systems, which America has been developing. So the Chinese and the Russians thought, hold on, at some point, we have to start up arming, okay, to develop missile systems or countermeasures that will be able to overcome American ballistic missile systems. Okay, that's basically what's happened. So they've succeeded.
After all, the US spends 10 times more on defense every year than Russia. What happened that the Americans have fallen so behind?
I don't have open source data on how much China and Russia have spent on developing hypersonic missiles. Okay, but open source research shows that the US has spent upwards of 25 to 30 billion dollars in unclassified spending programs across all agencies in the last 20 years on developing hypersonic missiles. So, it could be a lot higher. Okay, so there is no doubt that the US has the technical means to develop such missiles and systems that are equal or better, for want of a better word, than the threats we've just talked about. However, the main issue has been duplication of investment. To put it bluntly, too many cooks, if you will. So um, basically, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and DARPA have all been running separate, sometimes overlapping programs for years and years and years. So this fragmentation has led to duplication of effort, insufficient allocation of resources, and delays in transitioning prototypes to operational systems. Basically, you've got the Army competing against the Navy, competing against the Air Force, working with DARPA, working with NASA, and there's been duplication and so on. So it's a typical kind of like, too many cooks, not enough focus. But of course, now the hypersonic missile threats from China and Russia are real. It's clear and present danger. America is getting its act together.
The US, until now has the reputation of being the dominant power in space. Is that still true?
Okay, so that's a really critical question. But the short answer is no longer. Okay, no, it's no longer the case. Now, for about 20 years, the US enjoyed something close to hegemony in orbit. Okay, so-called space superiority. Okay, where no one really had the technological means to harm US satellites and systems. Now, during the 1980s, okay, there was what we call an RMA, a revolutionary military affairs. Okay, it's where the US was able to develop a space infrastructure of perhaps 120 to 150 satellites, which it could use as what we call a force multiplier. Okay, the classic example of this was in Desert Storm, where the US was able to use space-based ISR, which is information, surveillance, and reconnaissance, for want of a better word, spy satellites. Okay, combine that with its GPS system, which is basically a targeting system to make precision strike, while coordinating, troop movements, whatever it was doing all over the world on a global basis using satellite communications. So this meant that the US could, use space as a force multiplier to precision strike within a few meters, basically anywhere it wanted with impunity. Now, as we know, okay, again, Russia was supine in the 1990s and moving into mid 2000s. So Russians' own version of this basically fell to pieces over the process of about 15 years, and the Russians have been rebuilding this, over the last 15 years. But the Chinese, in particular, looked at Desert Storm in absolute horror. They realized that they were defenseless. They realized very, very quickly that they had to have their own RMA, their own ways to emulate and counter US space superiority. Okay, so the Chinese in the early 1990s started the crash program to do just that. Okay, and basically, long story short, I'll go into this in a little bit more detail further down in my answer. Okay, but if we look at, for example, one of the critical backbones for precision-based strike, which is the GPS satellites, okay, GPS satellites that the Americans use that we all know. Okay, the US has 31 operational GPS satellites. Okay, the Russians have steadily rebuilt their own version called GLONASS, and they now have 24 operational satellites, but China has 45 satellites. So you can see that the China already has, that precision strike capability. Now, in addition to developing that space infrastructure, and in addition to developing more and ever better and more lethal and faster missiles, including hypersonic light vehicles, the Chinese and the Russians have been really, really busy developing what we call counter space technologies, particularly anti-satellite weapons. Okay, these are called ASAT systems. Now, basically, these ASAT systems hold American satellites at risk. Okay, American satellites are no longer invulnerable. Okay, now we'll go on to a critical event a little bit later, but both China and Russia have the means to blind, cyber attack, or actually have attack satellites in orbit that can hold US satellites at risk. Now, this era started the modern era, the turning point, okay, for all this happened in 2011 when the Chinese launched a missile and blew up one of their old weather satellites. It was the Fenyang 1C. And this was what we call a DA, a direct ascent ASAT test. So they developed the technology where they could take a missile and blow up a satellite in orbit. And this immediately put the Americans on notice. All their space-based supremacy that they built, that they'd held on for 20 years, had just gone with one blown up satellite and a hell of a lot of debris that is still polluting the orbit. Okay, now still polluting orbit. But at the same time, I mentioned other counter space systems. Okay, so while the Chinese were, for example, developing, and the Russians have also developed, also have their own direct ascent ASAT systems. The Russians and the Chinese have been going gangbusters, okay, developing counter space satellites, okay. So particularly since the 1910s, they've been developing a wide range of what we call co-orbital ASAT systems. So these are satellites that can tag along or go near, be close to other satellites, and they can bump into them, they can jam them, or they can potentially fire missiles at them. Okay, so there are a whole range of these. There are now dozens, but there have been literally dozens of tests by the Chinese and by the Russians for these co-orbital ASAT systems. So, David, you would have noticed perhaps a week or two ago in the South China Morning Post, there was a recent article about a cluster of 5 Chinese satellites. So this was a pair and a group of 3 that were able to autonomously maneuver and simulate attacks and fly around each other. And this is called dogfighting. This is an incredible capability that the Americans currently don't have. And of course, this is only the tip of the iceberg. Okay, so there are dozens and dozens and dozens of these satellites that have been prototyped. I don't know if anybody knows how many of these satellites are actually operational in orbit, but I will tell you right away that the US's premier spy satellites, these are called KH-11 crystal spy satellites. They're basically Hubble-sized space Hubble space telescopes. Instead of looking out, at galaxies or black holes, whatever in the universe, they're actually turned around and pointed at Earth. Okay, so they have resolutions down to about 12, 15 centimeters, basically big Hubble telescopes. So there are 4 of those in operation. So in various different marks, the Americans have launched about 27 of these since 1976. All 4 of those KH-11 crystal satellites have Russian ASAT satellites tagging along with them. Okay, they're actually following them, trailing them in orbit, ready to do who knows what. Your guess is as good as mine. Okay, doesn't leave much to the imagination. Also, I'll leave you with one last point. Okay, so your readers might like to. You can see this article on the web. Okay, if they go to an article called "A China-US War in Space: The After Action Report" by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in January 2022. Okay, this has a scenario that the next war is going to be fought in space first. So in a series of war games. Okay, this is open source war games. There was a scenario where China was embargoing Taiwan and threatening Taiwan, and how were they going to guarantee that they could actually invade Taiwan? Their first step was to take out US US space systems. And in one scenario in 2030, the scenario predicted that the Chinese would have perhaps as many as 120 of these ASAT systems that go up and directly attack US satellites by 2030. And I think this is a very, very realistic scenario. I wouldn't be at all surprised if by 2030 the Chinese alone will have a three-figure number of these co-orbital ASAT systems.
Surely the US hasn't been sitting on its hand this entire time. I mean, what has been the US strategy until now to counter the Chinese and the Russian anti-satellite, capabilities?
The answer has been to develop what we call a proliferated, not a proliferation, a proliferated strategy, okay, of launching hundreds and hundreds of mainly low Earth orbit satellites that are linked together. Okay, the idea is that these hundreds and hundreds of satellites present just too many targets for Chinese or Russian ASAT systems, whether they be missiles or counter space satellites. So, as you can imagine, this is falling behind schedule. Okay, there are some satellites up there, but at the moment, the PWSA is composed of three tranches. Okay, so in these tranches, okay, there are eight. America being America and the Pentagon being the Pentagon, it doesn't have one layer or two layer, it has eight layers. But the crux, the backbone of the PWSA is called the transport layer and the tracking layer. So the transport layer is communication satellites. These are optically linked, high data bandwidth, communication satellites, all linked together and linked to the ground. Okay, and tracking satellites. So these are, the satellites that look down and track missiles, including hypersonic missiles, as they come up. So the first tranche, which is being launched this year, okay, the backbone communication layer has 126 communication satellites. Okay, and 28 missile tracking satellites. Okay, tranche two, which is coming up in a couple of years from now, will have an extra 250 satellites, and will increase the number of transport satellites, i.e. communication satellites, to 250, and add another 50 tracking layer satellites. Tranche three, which is planned for 2028 and beyond, will add another 140 transport layer satellites and another 54. So basically, the US wants to have a constellation of 400, 500, 600 satellites going around at any one time, a proliferated constellation that presents too many targets, okay, to hit through direct descent satellites, or to be blinded by lasers on the ground, or to be taken out by co-orbital ASAT systems.
If the US is already doing that, I mean, so why do they need Golden Dome? And how does Golden Dome, augment the US proliferation strategy, as you call it?
Okay, so now the major defining feature of the Golden Dome system is it seeks to add a layer or layers of space-based interceptors. In other words, that backbone, a constellation, will have Golden Dome missile interceptor satellites added to it into that network. So everything will be interlinked.
What are the technical issues with these systems.
So the problem of rockets blowing up, and not being able to get gear, kits, satellites into space has mainly been solved by SpaceX and Musk. But even the best designed satellites only last 5 to 7 years in orbit. Why? Okay, so a low Earth orbiting satellite goes in and out of the sun maybe 16 times a day. Okay, so when it travels around the Earth, it goes into sunlight, into shade. So, for example, the temperature differences, the temperature gradients, we call this, I think it's, we call this thermal loading or thermal stressing. You're going to go from like 120 degrees centigrade Celsius in sunlight suddenly to minus 160 degrees Celsius in shadow. So you're going in and out, in and out. Okay. Then you have radiation. Okay. You have radiation. Radiation affects electronics and so on. Okay. Then you have geomagnetic storms. Okay. You have radiation hazards caused by the sun, solar flares, and also this a thing called the solar maximum. When the sun expands and contracts in 10-year cycles. Now, to give you an idea, okay, about some of the technical challenges, okay, so in January 2025, okay, Starlink lost 120 satellites. They re-entered the Earth's atmosphere and burned up due to a solar maximum. This meant that the sun got bigger and the Earth's atmosphere expanded, and this increased drag on those low Earth orbit satellites and caused them to be dragged back down to Earth. So that's the very, very harsh operating environment. And then you have these satellites, and then you're going to arm them with 2, 4, 6, 8 missiles. So those missiles also have to be robust. They have fuel, probably solid fuel, but they have their own electronics. So, those satellites are only going to be useful for about 5 to 7 years. Then they have to be deorbited, and then new satellites and new systems have to be launched. And that doesn't begin, okay, that doesn't begin to address the technical hurdles of the system, of the system. So, there are think tanks that actually doubt that anybody, really has the technical capacity to have these satellites and to reliably be able to spot track, target, and then fire missiles to actually hit missiles on the way up. So those are, that's the second problem. And the third problem is, as we already have discussed in the previous answer, all those satellites are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to cyber attacks. They're vulnerable to radiation. They're vulnerable to laser blinding. They can be blinded by a very sophisticated system of chaff, by countermeasures. So missiles, as they go up, they can release, lots of fake missiles and balloons. So the sensors that don't know what they're tracking, they get confused. So every time, David, you dig into this a little bit deeper, you just see, the trapdoor falls and you see more and more problems. Really, I could go on about this for half an hour, but I've just tried to give you a very, very simple summary of some of the most obvious problems.
I mean, I think that's very interesting, and I mean, in a way, obvious. I mean, Boeing is struggling to keep his airplanes in the sky. I mean, we're talking about something that sounds like 100 times more difficult. Trump says it's going to cost $175 billion. I mean, is there any chance? It could be as low as $170 billion. $170 billion is nothing.
I want to give you some data points, David, okay? So late last month, BAE Systems won a competitive tender to supply 10 missile tracking satellites. It's a precursor to Golden Dome. It doesn't actually have any missiles on. These things don't have any missiles on them because that technology doesn't yet exist. So bear that in mind. Okay. So these 10 missile tracking satellites, okay, are going to cost, these 12 satellites are going to cost $1.2 billion. Okay. So that's roughly $100 million a satellite, sans missiles. Okay. Now, because you to have global coverage, you need to have to cover the Earth, any point in the Earth. You know, to the submarines here suddenly, bunch of submarines. You know, they could be anywhere. Start launching missiles. You need to have, okay, a space-based interceptor over that within 400 kilometers over that point of the Earth. Okay, so there are some figures flying around, but basically a consensus figure is that the minimum number of satellites, space-based interceptors you're going to need is something like 1,800, okay, of these space-based interceptors to be able to hit between 1 and 10 missiles. I will leave your viewers to do some math, okay? But let's look at some historical data, okay? Now, one of the precursors to Golden Dome, one of the present missile tracking systems is called the Space-Based Infrared System, the SBIRS. Okay, now that is 265% over budget. It's 9 years delayed, and it's cost $20 billion for 8 satellites. Okay, something closer to home. Okay, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter is 100% over budget at $400 billion, and it's 7 years behind schedule. Let's take another data point. Okay, the Sentinel ICBM system is currently 81% over budget, 3 years late, at $141 billion for precisely 0 ICBMs, which is a known technology. I mean, America's space enterprise was basically begun with ICBMs. Okay, let's take another example. The Army Future Combat System. Okay, this was a 6-year program. It was basically to make network tanks. Okay, how difficult could that be? Okay, this grew, the army managed to turn this into a gargantuan program. Okay, a gargantuan boondoggle. It ended up with 550 contractors and subcontractors, and they spent $32 billion in 6 years to produce absolutely nothing. Okay, so if you think about, okay, you're going to need something like 1,600 satellite-based interceptors, okay, 1,800 satellite interceptors, and you're going to have to replace those every 5 to 7 years. How much is that going to cost? I'll leave your mathematically minded viewers to start adding that up. Okay, so now there have been, some other figures. For example, the non-partisan Congressional Budget Office, okay, has estimated the basic figure to be 560 billion. Okay, an earlier study by the National Research Council put the cost at 800 billion. I'm just telling you, past president. Now, we can argue that these were legacy space systems, and technology has advanced and things are getting cheaper. But America has not launched a single satellite carrying missiles. This technology has to be developed and tested and launched.
Today we remember, Ronald Reagan as a great man because he forced the Soviet Union to try to match, the America's spending on defense, and that ended up, basically that ended up being the undoing of the Soviet Union. Now, Trump, is it possible that Trump thinks the same? That he thinks that if he goes down this path, that will force the Chinese and the Russians to follow suit, and that maybe he thinks that the Chinese and the Russian economy is so weak that this is going to force their economy into bankruptcy, and then America wins on the strength of its economic power in the end. What do you buy that argument?
If you're looking at 1,600, 1,800 space-based interceptors to be able to tackle 1 to 10 missiles, what's going to happen, when you're facing, 100 missiles or 1,000 missiles? You're swiftly getting into trillions of dollars. David, tell me, what is the current US sovereign debt? Is it 34 trillion?
Yeah, of
Is
course.
it
Yes.
climbing at what, $1 to $3 trillion a year? I would argue it's quite the reverse. It could well end up being that the Golden Dome could be the huge golden goose that turned into a lead parachute that could sink the American economy. I'm just speculating here, okay? But that's my take on it.
The question is there any chance that Trump can basically go out and build the Golden Dome without Elon Musk in SpaceX?
The Golden Dome is impossible, okay, to achieve without Elon Musk and SpaceX. Now, why is that? Okay, so let me think about some figures. So last year, okay, Elon Musk, SpaceX accounted for about 90%, okay, of the global satellite launch market. Okay, in 2024, okay, SpaceX launched about 106 times, with some of those Falcon 9s carrying multiple dozens of satellites. This year, at the moment, SpaceX is on for 120 launches. The next contender, if we take SpaceX out of the equation, is Blue Origin, okay, which is a completely unproven rocket. That is going to launch this year. Don't ask me when, but they are claiming that they can launch 10 times a year. Okay, and then there's another company called Rocket Lab, which has got the rocket called the Neutron that can launch maybe 5 to 10 times. So if we take away SpaceX launch capacity of about 120 plus, okay, in 2025, okay, basically the whole of the rest of the US space enterprise can muster 30 or 40 launches maybe next year. So basically, if you're looking at launching 1,600 SBI interceptors, this is getting away, from the 120 a year, sorry, every 2 or 3 years for the PSWA. You're looking at pushing out a Golden Dome from 3, 4, 5 years to 10, 15 years immediately. And that's basically it. So no SpaceX, no Golden Dome. That's the way I see it.
The Golden Dome, in fact, even came up, and right now, and Trump wants to spend on it. In a way, it should make us feel more pessimistic.
I think that Golden Dome is a wonderful exercise in marketing and optimism. There's a really big potential for a very, very expensive financial and technological train wreck in space.
Paul, thank you so much. This was fantastic. And I'm sure everybody probably are going to learn as much as I do. So thank you for your time.
It's been a great pleasure, David. Thank you.
Thank you very much again.